related to maybe to inform assessment information or evaluation information. So you can use focus groups for a number of different purposes. Maybe I'll just pause there and see if anyone has any comments or questions. Does that resonate so far, what I've said? Does that sound sort of like, yeah, that sounds like on track, it makes sense? Okay, great. All right, so let's see what's coming up next. So the ideal focus group is 8 to 12 people, typically lasts 1 to 1.5 hours. We try to provide incentives or kind of a thank you for people's time with focus groups. And in the good old days, food, healthy food. Hopefully those will come back soon. But, you know, want to make people comfortable and make sure that they're ready to kind of participate. Okay, so now we're going to go into the roles of the facilitator. But any quick comments or questions so far? Okay, this is good because we'll just get to more practice. Jennifer, looks like you have a question.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about presenting the results of the focus group. Going back when you were saying it's generalizing. So as a general practice, when you do present the results, do you just say, this is what we found on these dates? Like, what's the proper way of presenting it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll answer that briefly, and then if you know, we can offline give you more information about that. But usually you look for themes in the information. So if there's one focus group or more than one focus group, you kind of look for themes across. And then, yeah, you want to say, you know, this is how we recruited for the focus group. This is the number of people who participated. This is where we conducted the focus group. And that's background that's really important in order to say, and this is what those folks said, right? So that's the context to say, you know, we can't generalize to all participants in our program, but we can say, this is how we found the participants, this is who we invited, this is who, you know, and this is who came and said these things. I don't know, Paige, would you add anything to that?
So sometimes, right, it just depends on the purpose of the focus group, because sometimes, right, if it's for evaluation, it is typically around reporting. If it's for assessment, it may not be as important to fully report on it as to have some quotes and have the themes and use it to shape what your next steps are going to be. So you might take the information right away to focus and make a decision about what, you know, for the PSC grantees, right? If you're doing a focus group, you might use that to decide how you want to focus a multiple choice survey. That, you know, if there's clear interest in the focus group in this direction, maybe you get more specific or try to quantify it in the survey. Or if you've done a survey first, maybe you then try to get some information about the why or how you might have a successful intervention in the focus group. So it's often about getting more information. Again, if it's for evaluation or for kind of identifying as an assessment, like the needs for funding or the like specific policy recommendations, often you know, you do want to report it to some degree, and I would use all the ways that Kim just outlined, but often you can just take it and immediately put it to use, or at least once you've kind of, usually there's multiple focus groups that happen. And so if one person or multiple people are in all of the focus groups, they can have a conversation pretty easily and decide kind of what the themes are and next steps. If there aren't folks that are in all of them, then it still can be a conversation. It's a longer one, just to make sure that people have a shared understanding of the nuance and what people mean when they say things, right? People have different understanding of or different interpretation of what participants might say, and so it's still a conversation. But that plus the notes kind of help you identify themes across groups, across languages that groups are facilitated in.
Right. Okay, great. And John, it looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, Kim, just following up on what you just said about like collecting information about who comes. Would we be collecting like demographic data of people that come to the focus groups? Is that like a survey that you fill out beforehand or afterwards, or is it just like general observations about here's who came and here's
That's a
like
great question. I ideally we like to do a demographic survey at the beginning or end of the focus group, and typically if we're including incentives, it's sort of like, let's make sure we have your survey and then your demographic survey, and then here's your incentive. So it's a way of making sure that you have the right demographic information, right? Because we shouldn't be guessing at, there's certain demographics that you might want to make sure you have adequately heard from. And so it's a nice way to be able to present back and to say, this is who we heard from.
Yeah.
And we
And I
have
would,
some examples of those demographic surveys. I'll just say, in an hour and a half, it's hard to know exactly what to focus on. There's a lot of other information that we'd be happy to share after this. So, let us know how we can support that. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the roles of the facilitator. So again, I would just start with what's not on this slide, which is just to remember that while sometimes it's hard because you want to make sure people have the right information, you really want to just listen to what people's experiences and perspectives are rather than give them information in a focus group setting. So you want to guide and keep the discussion on track. There's typically a protocol or a series of questions that you prepare that then you ask the same questions to each focus group if you do multiple focus groups. You want to encourage participation in open conversation. One of the ways we do this, which we'll talk about in a minute, is to identify group agreements so that people know that what, typically as part of the group agreement, you say what's said here stays here. And so that, at the same time you're reporting information generally, you're not using people's names. And we're not talking later outside of the focus group about what she said or they said, or, and so you want to make sure that people really feel comfortable and understand what the data is going to be used for, right? This is an opportunity for them to express their perspectives, and you want to take that seriously. And with that, right, some people have perspectives and opinions that you might not agree with, but we want to be non-judgmental and not influence their answers. We really want to create a space that people feel comfortable in. And part of that is establishing rapport, making people feel comfortable and relaxed. Like I said, food helps when we're in person, just to make sure that people can be present and focused. And then you want to make sure that you understand the responses. So if you have a question about something that someone says and you don't understand it, you want to ask a follow-up question there. You also want to stick pretty close to the protocol, to the questions that you have, because you want to make sure when you're doing multiple focus groups that everybody has the opportunity to answer the same questions. And then there are ways that we'll talk about in a minute to, make sure you've heard from the range of folks. You don't want to call people out necessarily in terms of make people feel uncomfortable participating, but you really want to figure out ways to engage people who don't want to participate or don't look like they want to participate. So invite them in. And then there's always the dominant talkers or ramblers that I'm seeing smiles already. So we have experience with that. That's okay. People sometimes take a little longer to talk to explain their perspectives, but you do want to make sure there's space for others to participate. And then really be clear about no disrespecting each other in the conversation. So you can disagree, but not disrespect the disagreement. And Paige, let's see. So the next slide, right, facilitation technique. So before I go there, any quick questions? Paige is busy behind the scenes, as you can see, updating people's numbers, their names with numbers, and there's a reason for that, which we'll get to in a minute. Spencer, it looks like you have your hand up.
A quick question about not identifying people in the focus group. So say we ask a question about food access, right? Is it accessible for you to go to the grocery store, the local food bank, and pick up your food, right? And say half of our focus group are seniors or older adults over 65, the other half are people in their 20s, right? And say we find that more of the older adults say it's inaccessible to get to their source of food, while the younger adults find it accessible. When we're reporting on our findings, right, an older adult may not say it's because I have all these health issues or because I have a bad back that it's inaccessible. They might just say it's hard for me to get there. So what's your advice on just providing that context, which could be demographic about why certain participants gave certain answers.
That's a great point. So, and I'd be curious what others have to say, but I was thinking as you were talking, when I said you don't want to give identifying, I'll just clarify. What I meant to say was you don't want to give identifying information so that when someone reads the focus group findings, it says their name, right? So that's any sort of like identifying information like that is what you want to not include in the analysis. But what the kinds of differentiation, like the differences that you just pointed out would be, exactly what you would want to identify and say, what we saw was the younger participants said this, older participants said this, perhaps. And then that was a good example of maybe a follow-up question that you'd want to ask the participants to say, okay, so you just explained this. Could you give a little bit more information about why that is the case, do you think? So open it up so that if they understand or feel comfortable, like if they know the reason why, which in this case they probably do, but sometimes they might not, and invite them to further respond and that was a good example of like making sure that as the facilitator and note taker, you're working together to imagine when I report out on these data, I can explain what I need to explain when I leave this focus group. And that's something that I always keep in my mind that you just brought up. That is, if I leave this focus group and I still have a question, other people are going to still have a question. So you want to make sure all your questions are answered. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. And then it looks like another question came in on the chat. Are there any roles, tactics that are specific to online facilitating that are different from facilitating in person? Well, that's a good question. I feel like I really like making sure that people's videos are on, but that's not always possible, and so it is the world we're in. And you kind of want to invite people to do that at the beginning, but if it's not possible, as long as they're participating, I think it's fine. That would be one thing. I don't know if others have other. Paige, do you have another response to that might be different?
I mean, I think that we'll cover a little bit of not facilitation specifically around virtual versus in person at the end. But I think that the main thing is kind of being persistent and being patient and waiting. So like one online focus group I facilitated a few months ago, I did like 4 in a week, and one of them, I think one person had their video on out of like 8 or 10 participants. And one person was on the phone and had a lot of background noise and didn't know how to mute. And I didn't want to mute them because then I didn't know that they could actually unmute themselves. And that was actually one also that we were doing back and forth interpretation. And so like that one basically just like created a lot of space that there weren't any ramblers or folks that are really trying to dominate. It was entirely the opposite issue of there weren't people who were sharing. And so I really just went through one by one and called on everyone with different questions, and then tried to wait until they could at least acknowledge it. And if they didn't want to answer, that was totally fine. If they had a very short answer, that was totally fine. But really just tried to make a lot of space for it and really invite them very specifically one by one. And really removing any sort of potential, barriers that we could control. So not muting them, right? Like in like an online meeting, that's not a focus group. Often we choose to mute people intentionally because it's distracting other participants, because we actually want people to participate and we don't want to have them be confused about how to unmute. Erring on the side of maybe there's some background noise is probably a better call. And then certainly, I mean, depending upon the capacity of the person or people coordinating it, there's, and the digital sort of literacy and access of folks that are participating, there could be more support that's provided to folks kind of leading up to the focus group as well to support and to kind of encourage participation. But yeah, I mean, the eye scan and the video is pretty impossible to do when people have their video off, for sure.
Okay, and we'll have a chance to practice and then we'll reflect back. So we'll see more soon on that. Okay, next slide. All right. So, right, in general, this might be obvious, but just to say, again, the facilitation really is not about expressing your perspective. It's about gathering participants' experiences and perspectives. So you really want to stay out of that, even when people ask you direct questions during the focus group, which sometimes happens. And then, ideally don't agree or disagree with participants. There are ways that you can say, oh, thank you, that was helpful. I do things like that. I also generally kind of across the board say, thanks, that was great. But what you don't want to do is to say, oh, that was great to one person, but not great to somebody else, right? So you just want to stay consistent so that people don't feel judged. Let's see. Next, right. So again, this is limited in an online, but I think it's still true. You want to pause and make sure that there's time for folks to sort of take in information, ask questions, respond to the questions that you have. Even online, just like letting people know that you're with them. Move your eyes across, invite people to participate using nonverbal cues. So like somebody would say, looks like they have a ready to respond body language cue, take them up. And even if they're not ready, sometimes it'll prompt them to respond. And then I think it's true, one thing that's done probably more in online focus groups, in my experience too, has been, I'm just going to call on everybody and you can pass if you want. I do that in person, but even more so online. And then just make sure that you know what's being said. So this goes back to what we were talking about before. Could you say a little bit more about that, just to make sure that you're walking away with a clear understanding? And then there was, oh, okay. want to get through this because I definitely want to get us practicing. So before you begin the focus group, and we have examples of this where there's kind of a whole script that we have prepared where you introduce yourself and the co-facilitator, if you have one, explain the purpose of the focus group and how the information will be used. You want to remind people when the focus group will end and make sure that you know if people have to leave early, and explain how incentives will be given out because everyone wants to know how they're going to get their incentive, and explain how, what confidentiality means. So focus groups really should be confidential, meaning no names attached to anything anyone says. And then encourage people to participate and ask questions if they're not sure about what something means, and then review and establish the group agreements. Okay, what's next? Right. So these are some typical ones, but I think each group, you kind of want to have, you don't want to spend a lot of time on this. You really want to just make sure that everyone's in agreement on it. No right or wrong answers, speak one at a time, one mic. What's said here stays here, which is another way of saying maintaining confidentiality. Want to make sure there aren't really interruptions or other disrespect. So we just, want to call on folks, but we also want people to have a chance to speak. And then sometimes I ask, is there anything else that people have found effective? Oh, redirect the conversation, avoid confrontations. Say more about redirect the conversation.
So often the people they start talking about something else, right? So it's really difficult to redirect that conversation to the focus theme that we are doing with the focus group, right? And nowadays talking about politics or or racism is a thing, and at times it's time consuming, and you have to redirect the conversation many times during the focus group.
I see. Yeah. So maybe something like, I'm going to keep us, I do say this a lot, I'm going to keep us moving along because I really want to get to all the material. So, kind of like the essence is I'm redirecting. And then, right. So people can disagree, but avoid confrontation. So that's something we often say. Okay. What's next? Ensure each facilitator is clear about their role in the focus group. So this is something, if you're going to work with someone else to do the focus group, to make sure that, everyone is clear on who's going to do what and how you're going to get through the material. And I think the next one.
Another question from the chat from before around language.
Let's see. What was that? Go ahead.
If you have a group with various preferred languages, do you recommend anything specific? Best to divide up by language preference or have interpreters in a blended group?
Oh, yeah, great question. If people can speak in native languages, that's always my preference. But sometimes, depending on the language, the facilitator isn't able to speak the language that you want to hear from participants in. So that would be the second choice. I would say, if the facilitator is fine, ideally find a facilitator who speaks the language that you want to conduct the focus group in. And then someone says we did both. Rebecca says we did both depending on the size of the group. Yeah. So there are lots of ways to go around it. My first choice again would be to have the facilitator be fluent in the language. That's not always possible.
And obvious, but just in case you're unaware or not familiar with interpretation, right, it takes a lot of time. And so especially if the facilitator is not fluent in the language to be able to ask follow-up questions, they're going to need to have it translated back as well, right? It can't just be one way. And so the number of questions usually needs to be potentially slimmed, or you need to prioritize or have a longer focus group and a larger incentive or something to balance it out.
And so let's see, I'm just going to do a time check. So we're at 10:46. Time is flying. Let's see. So next up, what you've been waiting for, the mock focus group. So Paige, do you want to?
Sure. So I've chatted everyone their role. We need one person or potentially two people to volunteer as facilitators or co-facilitators. So you will not do your role, but who would like to volunteer? And again, we're happy to do one or two people.
Should we call on somebody? Come on, you know you want to try.
So many of you have done it already. The judgment-free zone, and we are actually stopping. Dongmei is going to stop the recording as well, so that nobody's feeling too sensitive.
That's a good point.
Challenging for me, knowing when to just really asserting and knowing when to jump in to like come in. And I think that that's always a challenge for me.
Mm-hmm. And Carlos?
I agree completely with Jennifer. It's always important to have someone next to you co-facilitating. It makes things easier, right? I did it once just myself and I was recording everything and that helped me with the note taking. But other than that, just like the situation that we have with John, and that's the kind of thing that we have when we are having focus group with our communities, right? So that was good to have two different personalities leading with this.
Mm-hmm.
Good experience. Thank you, Jennifer.
Great points. Other folks, what worked well? Go ahead, Alyssa.
I do appreciate the bringing back the community agreements, like, oh, you need to step back, or like one mic, because it kind of like brings back or like reels back to the main conversation and moving forward to, you know, the protocol or the focus group question. So great job, Carlos and Jennifer.
What else worked?
For the last question, Jennifer, you like started to ask the question, and then before you got to the end of it, you kind of said, you know, I want to hear from someone who we haven't heard from yet. My job was to obviously try and dominate the conversation. And so I was already like unmuted, like ready to jump in and answer the question. And then you said that. And so it did, like, even knowing that that was my role, it kind of forced me to be like, all right, fine, I'll type it in the chat, you know? So I think that was a good tactic to like get ahead of me, you know, getting in there.
Great. And other folks, anything that worked well? Okay, covered a lot of territory. Oh, and we have a chat saying, from Chankal, can I share once the spiral happened? I wanted to help the facilitators, right? There's like this, let's get in and help, but I think actually right. So it just kind of pulls on different heartstrings, I think. And you did a good job of not making it personal, but bringing people back to the purpose of the focus group, which is a tricky part. And I don't know, John, if you want to say anything about what it was like to be that person and what helped you kind of, if anything, feel like you got your perspective across and move on, right? Because that's kind of what we want. We want to hear and then move on.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a really good job of not shutting me out in a way that was going to make me mad or like more mad, right? Like, I think that, I don't know if you have the capabilities, but, you know, something that you could have done is like put me on mute, right? Like you could have muted me. And I think that that would have just made me more mad, right? Or like, you know, use language that you didn't use, language that I think could have like triggered me to be more mad either. So I think that you did a good job of bringing up the community agreements and reinforcing the, you know, step up, step back. I thought that was really good. Yeah.
I had written down the same thing. Okay, so Marianne says, I was not invited to speak, but maybe because I am staff and facilitators did not realize that I was assigned to a role. My role is to be quiet, but contribute freely when asked by the facilitator. So that's, we also are in time restrictions, but it is, yeah. And so I think it's helpful to try out to call, but it's not always possible with the time constraints, and that's real too. I don't know if you have any other thoughts. Oh, Carlos, you say, I called you judgmental. I think I lost it for a bit. And that's, yeah, so that's interesting. Like who's thinking what when you say certain things. Let's see, there was one point I'll just mention. I thought I caught like a tendency towards correcting the perspective of using sugary drinks as kind of consolation or a treat, and saying something about, you might want to move towards practices that are healthier. I think there was kind of like a moment there, which I think you caught and then went on. So that was good to catch yourself. It's hard because when people start talking about it and you really want to educate them. So that's just something to bring up. I say, even if it hadn't come up today, it's hard. And then the other thing is just wanting to make sure that, the focus group, typically focus group questions are open-ended, which means, and I'll get to your question in a minute, where you say, how did you feel? Or what was that like for you? And not so much how many, because a how many question has a direct numerical response, and that you can get from a survey typically. But we did want to, I thought this was interesting how you asked the how many, and then the follow-up question was say a little bit about why. And so I actually think that worked, especially given this topic. But just be aware of wanting to keep the questions wide open when you ask them. Let's see, right. And then there's a comment. I noticed Jennifer agreed with a lot of perspectives, but noticed she caught herself after a while. And that's, I think if you're consistently agreeing, even with folks that you disagree with, it's one thing, but that can get in a tricky situation because when you don't agree, then it's obvious. And Jennifer, you have your hand raised, and then Paige.
Yes, I did notice that this was doing this digitally, it was more challenging than in person because I can't, like, scanning the screen, it was really tough. But when we're in person, like, you can kind of feel you have that, like, a different dimension, like, of really engaging the group. So I found that a big difference between this and in person.
And yet you did really well. So that's impressive. Paige, you wanted to add something?
Just that I think that at least something that the one time that I feel like I often don't abide by the best practice of not agreeing or kind of reinforcing what someone's experience is depending upon the audience, and if it feels like it's something that folks have a lot of stigma around, or like whether it's like mental health stuff or something that people are often more reticent to share, or experiences that they might be ashamed of or feel like they're going to be judged around, not certainly like not agreeing with something or relating to something if it's not my experience, but kind of acknowledging it in some way as a way to hold space for it, or thanking them specifically for sharing that, or more broadly saying like, yes, that's totally something that a lot of people have experienced, or that that's really common or something, just so that that hopefully they don't feel super on the spot or alone.
I also really liked how at the end you summarized some of the main themes that you heard emerging in the reasons why, to explain why people were choosing sugary drinks. And often I think that's a really great technique to make sure that people know that you heard them. And then it's also an opportunity to say, do people agree, or is there another different perspective, and really use that as a launch to get maybe someone who hasn't spoken to say, oh, actually, that's not my experience, or yes. And you kind of track the nods. Like if there's a lot of agreement, you could ask for agreement so that you really get a sense of, is this a shared perspective, or is there something that someone hasn't said yet? So you can use it in different ways. I thought that worked really well. And then inviting those who haven't spoken to the degree that you had time, I think is a really good technique, especially like we were saying online. Great. Anything else that anyone is thinking worked or just was a challenge that you want?
I think we've covered these already, but I'll just flash them for a second.
Right. So some of the typical challenges in a focus group is the rambler, where the person kind of asks and answers their own questions and kind of keeps going. You know, and sometimes the stories are important, right? So that's a balance between, is this a story that's answering my question, in which case I want to give them the time, but also like if it feels like, I think Carlos, you said at the beginning, like someone's really meandering off topic, you only have limited time. So you have to consider that. One way to handle that is to paraphrase that person's main points and kind of jump in at a breath and ask if you're understanding what the person says and if they're, you know, if other people agree with them. So that's sometimes a way to move off of the person without being too blunt or disrespectful. And then sometimes people say, I just don't know, that's not my, you know, don't know how to answer this. So then another probing question sometimes helps. And then the slow poke just might need a little extra time, but you might want to invite other folks to, again, summarize and agree or disagree with the question, with the response. Anything else that you've found when you've had a group or participated with a group that has been challenging in facilitating? We've covered either through the experience or here. Okay. And the next slide.
So folks can read this, and again, we'll share this, just being aware of time, but just some few tips on, or considerations and tips on recruiting participants. So really figuring out right off the bat how many focus groups you're going to be conducting, what your key questions are for assessment or evaluation, and if there are specific perspectives or experiences you want to make sure are included. Right, so the number is really important to figure out how much you can focus on specific perspectives. It's always stronger for reporting focus group data if there are kind of groups of, each focus group has specific types of people in it. So that might be like residents of the Excelsior, residents of the Tenderloin is a different group. It might be folks that speak Spanish as their primary language in one group and folks that speak Filipino as a different group. It might be, you know, older adults and transition age youth as a different group. If you have, you know, the capacity to do more focus groups, that works out well. If you are limited by capacity, like time and budget, to doing say like 2, right, you still want a lot of those perspectives, and so you kind of usually want to pick the 1 or 2 demographics or experiences that feel most important to the assessment or evaluation question, and then group them in that way, and then hopefully take a demographic survey of some kind, either in the sign up or afterwards. Figuring out where you're going to hold the focus group, whether it's virtual or online, and who you're working with to recruit is also really important. So for in-person, often it works well to sort of piggyback on existing groups. So if there are existing kind of community meetings that get the kind of participants that you're looking for, coordinating with the organizers to basically come into one meeting or schedule an additional meeting so that you can speak with the folks that are already part of that group. That just reduces the burden of participation, so that folks don't have to carve out time in their schedule if they're already going. At the same time, that is sort of the scenario in which if there are strong personality conflicts, like some of the ones that we've viewed today in the practice with John calling out someone else that they'd seen at the marketplace and how much sugary drinks they'd consumed and such. If they know each other and they're in community with each other, right? Those personality conflicts exist, they're certainly potential to have that happen in a group like that. Whereas if you coordinate with various community groups or push it out through social media or a variety of methods, that's less likely to happen. Make sure you have simple recruitment materials, confirm, again, kind of thinking about if there's 8 to 12-ish people that you want. Usually we try to confirm between like 10 and 15, 16 people. Knowing that you still need to be able to give everyone the same incentives. So make sure you don't recruit too many people, but some folks are just gonna not show or have something come up. And then for online groups, there's often we've experienced that there's a lot more interest in online focus groups. That obviously will vary by digital access and literacy, but the people's availability that if they don't have to travel and take time sort of off work, like they can take their lunch hour at a different time, often are very interested in online focus groups because it's an easy way in some ways to get an incentive, which is good. But then that can create the problem of, you might have 70 people sign up and you only have room for 10 of them. And so if you create an online survey that has contact information, availability, and demographics, that can allow you to schedule pretty easily, looking at making sure that you're hitting the demographics either that are in common or that are varied that you are most interested in. Kim, do you want to speak to the note taker role for a minute?
Sure. And Carlos, you just chatted, the focus group has to be representative. It has to reflect our targeted population, different points of view. Usually each focus group is organized around one thing in common. And that's sort of what Paige was identifying. So you want to capture the information, but technically it isn't going to get everything. So, you have to balance that. So the note taker responsibilities, we have, there are some capabilities of digital recording like we've been doing. So sometimes that just, for online focus groups that helps. But typically we have in addition to that, a focus group note taker. So you have the protocol questions, and then before you actually ask the questions, this seems like a small detail, but you want to actually have a note ready to go so that when people start talking, you're ready to type. And you just take action notes so you don't actually take, down every single thing people say. So keywords there. And then you want to make sure that it's okay with the focus group to let them know that you're recording, but again, repeat that you're not going to take down any names. And then, you want to capture the number of participants, the date, the language spoken at the focus group. And sometimes we've done where you assign a number to each person and then you go back and say, number 3 says this. And I think the note taker has an important role with helping the facilitator keeping the group on track if you don't have a co-facilitator. And you can just make arrangements before the focus group to say, like if things get out of hand, note taker, help me out in this way. So you can sort of use the note taker strategically in that way. And then, maintain neutrality, just want to be part of the background really, and then ask for clarification if needed. And similarly, like we said before, you want to make sure that you walk away with a clear understanding of what people have said. And I think with 3 minutes left, I'm just going to move on. Again, we'll share this.
Yeah, we have a few nuts and bolts for before and day of and after the in-person and virtual focus groups. And so we'll share that.
And just a few minutes left for any final questions.
Sorry, would you mind going back one slide so we can just see those nuts and bolts? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Right. So the idea is that this prompts you before the focus group, what to do, the day of the focus group, what to do. you know, and this is depending on if we're in person or virtual,
Mhm.
might slightly be modified.
So right, so question in the chat around the how the data is analyzed. If the session's recorded or transcribed, is it helpful to organize in a spreadsheet or grouping information by theme in a document or other platforms? So it really depends upon how many focus groups you're doing. If you're doing probably like 6 or fewer, a conversation with printed out or notes, or at least doing, you know, a virtual meeting with shared screen and being able to look at the notes, you know, focus group 1 notes, focus group 2 notes, focus group 3 notes, side by side for the answers for each of the questions. So it might be in a spreadsheet, it might be in a Word doc, kind of whatever you feel like is most useful, is a good way to kind of talk through and confirm sort of what themes seem to be emerging, and again, kind of get the nuance of, oh, like, yes, all of them, maybe everyone agrees that it's hard for them to get affordable, healthy produce, but the older adults are really talking about it's really hard for them to get to the actual store. And that's not something that came up in the other group. So clarifying what is common and then the nuance of what's different or the specificity of it is important for the analysis process. If you're doing more than 6, or, you know, often if you're doing like 10 or 20 or something, in order to actually keep it systematic, you often have a lot more facilitators involved and obviously a lot more notes. Each focus group transcript will often be like 20, 30 pages long, although the notes will be at least a few minutes. We're happy to talk offline afterwards about that some more, if you're going to be in that boat.
I think with just a few seconds left, I know you're super busy, but we're happy to follow up in addition with this material. You know, we have prompts or scripts that are helpful to begin a focus group as background. And we can also, through our TA work with SDDT evaluation, provide additional support. But this was sort of the general overview of focus groups. And we're going to do another training, right, Paige? Do you want to
next week?
About that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah. So next week we'll same time, same place. Although I think it's actually technically a different Zoom link that Dongmei sent out. We'll be practicing administering surveys. So online, in person, or on the phone. And really, you don't really administer online surveys so much. So emphasis on doing it in person or on the phone. But we'll do a similar kind of why you would do it, information about it, developing it, and then practicing it. And then one final thing is for both the surveys and for focus groups, we also have example consent forms and assent forms. So we often get consent forms for all focus group participants, although you don't have to, but we do usually recommend it for minors, basically, to get parental or guardian consent. And we're, again, happy to share examples of that or talk about that with anyone who wants to afterwards.
And with that, I'm happy to stay if anyone has any last questions, but just want to say thank you so much for joining us. Love that we're doing this together. Evaluation from our perspective is such an opportunity to reflect back the hard work and the perspective and experiences from community members. So it's really an opportunity to capture their stories and tell the story. So with that, oh, good. There's lots of, okay. Sharing of information. Yep. Focus group reports. Great. Thank you all.
Thank you, Kim and Paige, for the great presentation, and the training is very helpful. I learned a lot from the workshop too. And thank you everyone for joining this training, and we'll see you next week. And then if you have any follow-up question, feel free to email me, and then I can help follow up with Kim and Paige. Sorry. Yeah, and then like Paige mentioned earlier, I will send out this slide and with other like support documents to everyone who participate, or even like the people who are interested but unable to join today, so they can also learn from the recording. Yeah, I will send out the recording too. Yeah, I'm sorry for forgetting to click the recording button. That's a lesson learned. Like if you in the future you do the focus group, yeah, remember to to click the recording button. Okay, thank you everyone. So have a great day, and we'll send out email for follow-up questions. Okay,
Thanks again. Bye.
thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
cool.